Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mystery and Reason, Lecture 6.1. So let's recap what we did in 5.3, where we started talking about argument evaluation. So you've seen this slide before, but it's worth repeating. So here's the basic idea. When someone gives an argument, what are they doing? They're claiming that the premises they've got show that their conclusion is a better answer to the IQ than the other rivals. Okay, so that's what we said before we started doing argument evaluation. And I put the emphasis on claiming here. This is what the author of the argument, is claiming to be the case. But the question for us as evaluators of their argument is whether it's actually the case. So there's the diagram. We've talked about that. To evaluate an argument means to determine whether the premises actually show that the conclusion is a better answer to the IQ than its rivals. Okay. So we do this first by making a list of the serious rivals, the ones that are worth taking seriously. And then we provide a ranking of the serious rivals from most plausible at the top to least plausible at the bottom, including ties where appropriate. Okay. So that's what we're doing. This brings us to a concept that is a little bit confusing terminologically because we're using the same word in two different ways. So we're going to define something called a sound argument here, and it's different, unfortunately, from what we called a sound argument earlier. I'll try to clear that up as we go through this, but let's stay with what we were just talking about and notice that sometimes we might decide that the author's conclusion belongs at the top of the ranking. Okay. I would say in the examples we're going to look at, we will often think that the author's conclusion is indeed the most plausible answer to the IQ. Okay. Um, and if we do so, if we think that the author is right, that their conclusion is the best answer to the IQ compared to the other rivals, so that means we agree with the author that given the support they have presented, their conclusion, which we will always call C1, is more plausible than C2, C3, and so forth. And so if that's the case, if the author's conclusion is at the top of our ranking, then our evaluation of their argument is um we say that we say that they have given a sound argument. Okay, so a sound argument just means one where what the author is claiming to be the case really is the case according to us. Okay, so if we think their argument is sound, it means we agree with them that their conclusion is better than the rivals. Of course, they might not have listed the rivals. We have. So in a way, we're putting a stamp of approval on the author's argument, uh, where we are taking into account the rivals. We've listed them and ranked them. The author hasn't done that. But our stamp of approval saying that they've got a sound argument confirms what they've said, but it's backed up by our ranking of rivals. Okay. So here's the confusing thing. The concept of sound that we're defining here is really meant to apply to inductive arguments or non-deductive arguments. It's very different from the concept of sound that we learned a couple weeks ago, which applies only to deductive arguments. So if you recall, a sound deductive argument is one that's valid and has true premises. A sound non-deductive argument or inductive argument is what we've just defined. It's one where the author's conclusion is more plausible than any of the rival conclusions. So those are very different concepts. And unfortunately, so I guess the reason there's this clash of terminology is the word sound in ordinary English usually just means when it's applied to an argument, usually just means it's a good argument without, and and people who say that an argument is good are in ordinary, contexts are not necessarily thinking about whether it's deductive or inductive or any of the technical stuff that we've gotten into. They just mean it's a good, so that's sound reasoning. Like you're doing things pretty well, right? And then in logic, the concept was then made into a technical term to apply to valid deductive arguments with all true premises. And then Larry Wright, in his critical thinking book that we're using, decided to make it a technical term for inductive arguments, and that's what we're using right now. So I apologize for that ambiguity. Anytime I give you, if I put this word on like a quiz or an exam, I will make sure to be clear about which concept I'm talking about. Okay, with that being said, let's look at some pictures of rankings here. So if the author's conclusion is C1, then if we've got a ranking that looks like this with C1 at the top, we can label that, we will say that means we are judging their argument to be sound. If our ranking looks like this, where the author's conclusion is somewhere other than the top, we say they've given an unsound argument. And whoever is giving an argument with C3 as their conclusion, they're the ones giving the sound argument. Okay. So the sound argument is the one that, whose conclusion wins in our ranking of rivals. Okay. But yeah. Okay. So to say that an argument is sound, one more time, is to say that the author's conclusion C1 is the best answer to the IQ given everything that's known about the case so far. So let me bring in another little wrinkle here that's going to lead us towards the next topic. If the case is subject to an ongoing investigation, it may turn out that new evidence comes to light. In other words, where evidence is going to be new premises or new pieces of support, and that may lead us to change our ranking. So we're going to look at this maybe in the next lecture. The idea of an investigation is where the argument might change over time as new evidence is gathered. And if that happens, the ranking can change. And so a sound argument at one stage of the investigation can become unsound or vice versa. So if the ranking changes, of course, C1 drops down here and C3 rises to the top based on new evidence, then the author's argument from the beginning is no longer sound. And, if the author of the argument is the investigators, they need to change their conclusion to become the one that's now most plausible if they want to continue being sound reasoners. Okay. So we'll get into investigations a little bit later. But let's do some more practice with evaluating arguments and ranking the rivals. So let's do one of our other examples that we've looked at before, the case of the missing flight. So remember from a few lectures ago, we had this one. I'll read it again. The radio crackled madly and we lost radio contact with flight 544 just as it entered an ominous-looking storm cell about 6 hours ago. It's now 4 hours overdue at its destination. We've had no word from it. The terminal staff is doing its best to cheer the people in our waiting room, but I think the worst has happened. So remember that our IQ, let's see, it's good practice for you to try to come up with it. Again, what's the question we're trying to answer here? What happened to Flight 544, right? We all want to know what happened to it, why haven't we heard from it, and so on, right? The schema that we came up with, well, we said that one premise is that it entered the storm 6 hours ago. Another one is that we've had no word from it since then, and that they're 4 hours overdue at their destination. And our conclusion, which the author, I remember, uses a sort of euphemistic way of phrasing it by saying the worst has happened without getting into details, it seems like what they really mean is that they think the plane has probably crashed or otherwise been destroyed somehow, right? Okay. So that's their conclusion. I can't remember if we listed rivals yet. I don't think we have. So now, since we're coming at this example, having learned about rival conclusions in the meantime, let's list some serious rivals to the plane crash conclusion. What else could have happened to it? So what happened to Flight 544? It crashed, or see if you can come up with some. I think there's really just two main rivals here, two main serious rivals. One would be that, but so if it hasn't crashed, what could be going on with it? Well, I guess the main thing, the way I see it is either it's in the air still or it's on the ground somewhere, right? Those are kind of like the two uh, places it could be. It's still intact, it hasn't crashed, but it's either still flying or it has landed. But if it's landed, and we haven't had any word from it, what do you think that implies? Well, I'm going to say something like this. The plane made an emergency landing somewhere. Emergency landing meaning like somewhere other than an airport. I probably should have added that. Somewhere other than an airport, okay? And so that's considered a serious rival. That's considered plausible because if they landed in the middle of some field in some farmlands away from any major cities, maybe nobody has gotten a chance to, get the word out. Now, I guess I should say some of these examples from Larry's book are a little bit outdated. Um, he's in his 80s and he probably wrote the first edition of this book like several decades ago. So I don't think everybody had cell phones at the time he was writing this. So let's picture this going on, in the 80s, or if you can, where nobody had cell phones. So if they made the emergency landing, nobody's, they've got to make contact with somebody at the nearest town or something like that before they can get the word out that they've landed safely, right? Okay, so with that context in mind, C2 could be considered a serious rival. Okay. C3 would be the plane is still in the air. Okay, it's presumably off course. It had like something happened with the storm. It had to avoid it. Maybe the plane is damaged, but it hasn't crashed. They don't have, their radio is no longer working, but they're still flying. Okay, so I think those are really the main serious rivals. So let's evaluate it. What do you think is the most plausible of the three? And hopefully, I still feel the same way that I did about this. Hopefully, my judgment about this is the same as what I've got on the slide. Sometimes when I come to these examples, even though talked about them so many times, I'll come to them again and suddenly it'll strike me differently. So I said that I think C1 seems to be the most plausible given the storm. So this maybe the plane got struck by lightning and it just completely just destroyed one of the wings and it just went down, right? Something like that could potentially happen as far as I know. Um, maybe that's not true. Maybe planes are like immune to lightning or something. I don't they're made out of the right kind of, metal and it goes right around them. Who knows? Okay. I don't know enough about the physics of that. But that seems pretty plausible, especially given that we haven't heard from them for that long. Even without cell phones, it seems like if they made an emergency landing, somebody would have noticed, somebody would have called it in, and we would have heard from them by then, right? As far as C3, I would say that seems a little bit more plausible than C2, because again, there would likely be some word from them if they had landed. So maybe they're just still in the air and they don't have any communication capacity and they rerouted and significantly. It's a little bit implausible because 4 hours overdue. Did they really have to take a detour that added 4 hours to their flight time? Maybe they turned around. Maybe they headed to maybe they went to a different airport, but then again, we probably would have heard from them if that was the case. So again, yeah, C2 and C3 don't seem that plausible to me compared to the author's conclusion. So that's how I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna put C1 at the top of the ranking. Plane is still in the air. I guess I have it above emergency landing, although I think you could go either way on that, and maybe C3 and C2 are tied. This one's a little bit hard, I would say. You really do have to make, a judgment call where you're not necessarily super confident about it. But if you're doing an investigation, you've got to have some, um, you know, preliminary ideas. You've got to say, this is what we think happened right now, but we're also considering these possibilities. And then hopefully we'll get some more evidence that will improve our ranking and give us more confidence in our conclusion. Okay. So we will consider this a sound argument if we agree. If you agree with me that the author's conclusion is the most plausible compared to these rivals, we would say it's a sound argument. Okay. Another issue we haven't focused on yet is the role of the support in the argument. We spent a lot of time looking at the conclusion and its rival conclusions and ranking those. But we've sort of underemphasized the role of the support or the premises. Of course, we're always looking at them. Those are sort of the information that's available to us, and that's guiding the judgment calls we're making when we're, coming up with rivals and ranking those rivals. But let's talk a little bit more in a more detailed way about how the support works. So initially, when we first talked about what an argument was, we said that the support or premises are what an author provides in order to give us a reason to believe their conclusion. More recently, what we've been saying is that the author of an argument is trying to use their support to show that their conclusion is a better answer to the IQ than the rivals. But now that we're in the business of ranking the rivals, we can have a more detailed understanding of exactly how the support does what it does. We can articulate in what exact way each piece of support gives us a reason to think that the conclusion is the best answer to the IQ. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to look at each piece of support and say how it affects the ranking. Okay. And we're going to call this the relevance of the support. Okay. So there's, an unlimited number of facts that could always be, considered in any case. But when we choose certain facts to be our premises, our support, we do that because we think they are relevant to the case that we're trying to reason about, right? So we want to know how they're relevant. So what we would like to be able to do is describe how each premise, each piece of support functions in an argument. In other words, we want to articulate the relevance of the support that an author provides. Okay? So let's define the relevance of a given premise S to be the way that S affects the ranking of the rivals. So the relevance of a premise is how it affects the ranking. Okay. There's a book about relevance. If you're interested, I haven't read it. I just put it there to have an image. So, there's an extra word there. To determine the relevance of a piece of support, what do? Well, we should consider how the ranking would be different if we didn't have that piece of support. So we sort of take it away, see how the ranking would change, and then put it back and see how the ranking comes back to the way that it was. And based on how certain rivals either move up or down in the ranking, whether or not we have a given piece of support in the argument, that will tell us how that piece of support is relevant to the ranking. Okay. It shows us sort of what difference it makes to the ranking. That's what we want to know. What difference does this premise make to the ranking of the rivals? So that's what I say here. By describing how S makes a difference to the ranking by being present in the argument, that's how we are going to articulate its relevance to the argument. Okay? So let's continue with flight 544, and we'll articulate the relevance of the support. So here's our rivals, here's our ranking. Okay, so what is the relevance of S1? So let's pretend like we didn't know about the storm. All right. If we knew nothing about a storm and all we knew was that we've had no word from this plane for the last 6 hours and they're 4 hours overdue, would we still think that the plane had crashed? Would that still be the most plausible? Maybe not, right? Maybe S1 was a big part of why we thought that C1 was the most plausible answer. So C1, S1 definitely helps or raises C1 in the ranking. Okay. So we'll often talk about a piece of support raising or lowering a given rival. Um, a nice connection between two sort of metaphors that we're using is we can also just say S1 supports C1 in particular. It provides support for C1 more than C2 and C3. And so when we're talking about, so this kind of the metaphor I'm thinking of is the ranking is, it's especially because we show it vertically. When something gets raised in the ranking, think of that as like a piece of support is supporting it and lifting it up, right? So the support is like, putting an upward force on one of these rival conclusions to make it more plausible. And if that support's not there, it falls down, right? So there's a nice connection between the metaphors here. We've been using the word support so much, you might have just forgotten about the fact that like the literal meaning of supporting something, physically, the physical meaning means to sort of prevent it from falling down, right? But that's kind of a nice metaphor here because we rank things vertically, and so when a piece of support supports a given conclusion, it lifts it up, it raises it in the ranking. Okay. So, yes, so to articulate the relevance of S1, we consider how things would stand without it. With no storm, a crash would be less plausible. So, the relevance of S1 is that it raises C1 in the ranking. It raises it compared to a situation where we didn't know about the storm, right? So the presence of S1 in the argument makes C1 higher than it otherwise would be. It supports it, it raises it, it lifts it up. Okay, good. How about S2 or S3? So I'm just going to read what I have here because I don't want to say something that's different. So if S2 or S3 were false, so if we take one of those away, not false, but if we just didn't, well, yeah, yeah, so in other words, if we weren't saying that, if we weren't saying S2, if we weren't claiming that as part of our argument, then that would imply we have had word from them, right? And if they weren't overdue at their destination, if they had arrived at their destination, then we wouldn't, in a way, if neither of these were here, we wouldn't even be asking the implicit question of what happened to the flight. We would know what happened to it, right? So the question wouldn't even arise, and the argument wouldn't even be given. Okay. However, if the plane made an emergency landing, so let's look at C2 for a second, there's a higher chance that they would have managed to contact us compared to being in the air with no radio capacity, right? So the fact that they haven't contacted us, S2, we can say it lowers C2 in the ranking. So part of the reason we put C2 at the bottom was because if they made that emergency landing, we probably would have heard from them. So yeah, they would still be not at their destination, but we probably would have heard if they had landed somewhere, unless it was in a completely remote location, right? So we say that the presence of S2 here lowers C2. So sometimes pieces of support directly support one conclusion. Sometimes they sort of indirectly support a conclusion by lowering other ones in the ranking. And that's what's happening here. So S2 lowers C2. That's how we articulate its relevance. Okay. And as far as S3 is concerned, I guess I don't say anything about that directly. So again, if they weren't 4 hours overdue, I mean, yeah, we wouldn't even be asking what happened to it. They would be at their destination, and none of these rivals would be plausible, right? So yeah, there's just um but okay, so why is S3 in the argument? Well, yeah, I mean it's there because sometimes a piece of support is there just because it shows us why we have a question in the first place, right? So the fact that they're overdue is part of why we're wondering where they are. Okay, so we can't always, say some nice, crisp statement like The relevance of S1 is that it raises C1. The relevance of S2 is that it lowers C2. I don't know if we can do that with S3, but maybe I'm not thinking about it clearly enough. Maybe you can say something uh, better than I am right now. But I'm going to move on. Okay, so let's list. So there's different ways, as we just saw. We saw two different ways that support can be relevant. So there's a few different ways in which a premise can be relevant, a few different ways in which it can affect the ranking of rivals. It can raise or lower rivals. That's what we've seen so far. What else can it do? It can widen, narrow, or close gaps between rivals. I should have said it can open, close, widen, or narrow. Let me fix that. Hold on. Okay, so this is sort of a new idea that I haven't mentioned yet. Sometimes we're going to put gaps between rivals. If we want to show that one rival is much more plausible than another, or than like the rest of them, we might have a gap between that one and all the others. Okay. And so sometimes the relevance of a certain premise can be that it creates that gap, it opens that gap, or a premise can close a gap that was there before, or it could widen it or narrow it. So this is getting, a little bit more, detailed than we usually will be, but we could, get into these details sometimes. It could a given premise can actually add or remove rivals from the list of serious rivals. That's sort of a version of raising or lowering, right? Because the unserious rivals are somewhere below the bottom of the ranking. So if one of those unserious rivals suddenly gets raised by a new piece of support, it can show up on the list of serious rivals all of a sudden, or a serious rival can become unserious, and be removed from the ranking, um, based on a piece of support coming to light. Sometimes a piece of support can split a rival into two more specific ones, or maybe it can lump two or more rivals together into a more general one. We have looked at a case of that, I think. We talked about splitting. Well, we didn't really talk about splitting rivals, but when we were talking about rephrasing rivals to make sure they don't overlap, that's sort of a version of this where we, so just to give an example, because I don't know if I have an example coming up anytime soon. If we were to look at the motel explosion case, and it turned out that we did find, let's say, um, the ingredients of a bomb, right? So one of the rivals was somebody set off a bomb, right? So let's say we find some things that could have been used to make a bomb as we're, investigating. Then we might split the bomb rival into, then since we're taking it more seriously, so first of all, that would obviously raise the bomb rival quite a bit. It might bring it to the top of the ranking. It might even bring it to the top and create a gap between it and all the other ones. Who knows? But it might also split it up into two versions of the bomb rival, which would be the bomb was intentionally detonated, it was meant to destroy the motel, or it was accidentally detonated because they were just making it to use it elsewhere, right? I kind of mentioned that earlier, so that's why I wanted to go back to that example. So that would be a more complicated way in which a new piece of evidence, finding the bomb ingredients, would affect the ranking in some of these ways. Okay. And sometimes a new piece of support can change the amount of detail involved in a rival. Usually we want our rivals to not be super detailed. They should be, big wedges in the space of possibilities. They should include a big range of things. I didn't really talk about that. I should have mentioned that when we were first learning about rivals, that you shouldn't make your rivals super detailed. So when you say somebody, set off a bomb, we shouldn't say someone set off a bomb made out of, C4. Like, why would we put in that specific, chemical? If we, it should just be, there's a bomb, right? But then if we find C4 in some room, then that will, be part of that will become a detail that will be included in the statement of that rival. Okay. All right, one more topic for this lecture, general versus specific support. So we've been talking about the relevance of support. Now what I want to do is distinguish between two types of support. So let's look at a new example. Um, this is from page 181. I don't know if I've given you the reading from that yet, but I will soon if I haven't already. Okay, so here it goes. Some of my plants have wilted in spite of having plenty of water. I started watering them more frequently at the first sign of wilting, but it did no good. I wonder why. A neighbor who knows something about gardening informs me that some plants are subject to a root fungus common in local soil and must be allowed to dry out between waterings to keep the fungus at a tolerable level. This supplements my general botanic understanding enough that I can now figure out what's happening. Okay. So, I think this time we'll start with the implicit question. Okay. What do we think the person who's worried about their plants, what are they trying to figure out? So before we even say what their conclusion is or what their answer is, what's their question? In fact, the phrase that I often use, what are they trying to figure out? Figure out it occurs here. So this supplements my understanding enough that I can now figure out what's happening. What's happening with what? Well, with the plants, of course. Well, what did they already tell us was happening? Well, they're wilting despite having plenty of water. So we're troubled by the fact that they're wilting. That's what we're trying to figure out the cause of, right? We're trying to figure out why they are wilting. Why are my plants wilting? That's what we want to know, right? That's what the author's trying to answer. Okay, good. Next, let's make their answer explicit. So after they consult their neighbor, what do they think it is? Well, they think it's probably the root fungus, right? The plants have a root fungus. Okay, sometimes it's called root rot, I believe. Um, okay, so that's the question. That's their answer. What else? Oh, there's a little diagram for you. I always have this problem with my plants. I'm so bad at keeping them healthy. Okay, so let's find the support. So what's the support? Why do we think they have the root fungus? Well, um, so first of all, they are wilting. Let's put that in there, right? If they weren't wilting, we wouldn't be asking the question and we wouldn't have any reason to think they've got the fungus, right? So my plants are wilting is one of those sort of basic premises that raises the implicit question in the first place, right? We should include that in there. Secondly, I have been watering them frequently. That's relevant, right? Because as the neighbor tells me, watering frequently can cause root rot or root fungus, right? Overwatering can encourage a root fungus. Okay. And so that seems to be the main pieces of support here. But what we want to do in this case is talk about two different kinds of support. So do you notice any significant difference between S3 and the other two premises? How is it a different sort of fact? Well, S1 and S2, we could say, are particular facts about the author's specific plants, right? My plants are wilting. I have been watering my plants frequently. These are not statements about plants in general. So the author knows what's going on with his or her own plants on a first-hand basis. They are the author's specific plants. Let's call this kind of support specific support. It's specific to this case, right? By contrast, S3, the fact that overwatering can encourage a root fungus, this is supposed to be a general fact about something that's common to many plants. The author happens to rely on their neighbor's expert knowledge regarding this. I mean, I don't know how big of an expert you need to be, but the neighbor knows more than they do, so they defer to them. The neighbor has this general background knowledge about plants, which they probably learned from someone else as well. And so we will call this general support. Okay, this is information that's, yeah, passed from one person to another about plants in general. Very different from how the first two premises are specific facts known directly or in a first-hand way about these specific plants, right? So specific versus general support is the distinction we're drawing here. Okay. So specific and general, super commonly used concepts in everything, but specifically in philosophy, critical thinking. It's good to use the contrast between general and specific in various different places, and we can think of it as a spectrum. So, at the very general level, we can talk about a car. And then we can get more and more specific. A sports car, a Ford sports car, a Mustang Boss, a 1970 Mustang Boss, a 1970 Bees Gold Mustang Boss. I don't know anything about cars. I guess this is a cool one. Um, and I don't know about this little thing here. I didn't create this chart. I just found it. Okay, so general versus specific, right? Plants in general can have this problem. My plants in particular, or in specifically, are having this problem. Okay. Generally speaking, general support will often be technical, theoretical, or scientific knowledge, whereas details about particular people, places, or times will typically be specific support. Okay. So let's do one last example to test out these concepts. This is from page 182. The deftly skinned animal carcasses that have been turning up in Lakewood are the remains of coyotes, not dogs, that were apparently caught in steel traps and killed for their pelts, SPCA officers said Thursday. An autopsy performed on the last of the four carcasses that have been discovered since December show that the animal had fed on small animals and possibly a bird, according to Corporal Vicky Young of the Los Angeles SPCA. This is typical coyote food, Young said. Okay. So what should we do first here? Well, uh, do everything. Well, no, do these things. You try it. Formulate the IQ. That's what I recommend starting with. State the conclusion. Maybe you can start with that instead. Give the most plausible rival, so just one rival, and also identify the general support. And if you want to identify the specific support too, that's good, but we want to focus on general support here. That's the sort of one that is going to stand out. Okay, so give it a try. And when you're ready, I think the implicit question should be something like, what kind of animals are the carcasses from? Right? The fact that the passage starts with the carcasses are the remains of coyotes, not dogs, implies that people were wondering, are these dogs that are these why are there these dead dogs, that we found, and they're skinned. It's pretty brutal. And then it turns out they're coyotes. Maybe that changes how, people feel about it. It changes, who's responsible, perhaps. Um, and also it seems like the author is, giving an answer that, like, that sentence, that first sentence is giving an answer to this question, right? So that would be the conclusion, and these are the remains of coyotes. So we can give one word answers to the IQ when it says, what kind of animals are the carcasses from? Coyotes is the conclusion, right? Of course, if we were writing up the schema, we would want the conclusion to be a complete sentence. What's another rival? Well, it's explicitly stated in the passage now that the carcasses are from coyotes, not from dogs. But dogs would be a rival conclusion because they look pretty similar to coyotes, right? So they could be dogs. Okay. And then what here would be a piece of support that is general? Well, let's go through it. So they were apparently caught in steel traps. That could be specific support because that's specific to this case. And killed for their pelts. That's more of a further inference, I think. So this might be a more complex argument if we were to fully analyze it. The fact that they were killed for their pelts, and the fact that it says they were apparently killed for their pelts, means that that's being inferred. Apparently is an inference indicator. It's kind of like probably, or yeah, things like that. Um, an autopsy performed showed that the animal had fed on small animals and possibly a bird. That's all specific support. We're talking about this specific animal that got an autopsy done on it. And then Vicky Young tells us this is typical coyote food. Ah, typical. Typical means something like general. This is the kind of stuff that coyotes eat in general. So coyotes typically feed on small mammals and birds. That's the general support. And the typical, I should have only highlighted typically in blue. Light blue is not a color for general support. Okay. Um, yeah. So that's the general support here. And then there's a bunch of specific support. We won't write the full schema of the argument. I just wanted to show you that this fact here is general support because it's not just about this particular case. It's based on general background knowledge of coyotes and their diets. Okay, good. So we'll leave it at that. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.